Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your host, Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. We're continuing our mini-series on 20th century Catholic French composers today with a discussion about Charles Tournemire, focusing on his improvisations, his study with César Franck, and especially his monumental work, L'Orgue Mystique. My guest today is Kevin Faulkner, who is currently finishing up a biography on this important composer. If you're interested in studying organ improvisation, we're offering a seminar in organ improvisation this summer at the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music, July 17th through the 21st at St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park, taught by a winner of the Tournemire Prize in Improvisation at the St. Albans competition, Dr. Christoph Tietze. The seminar is limited to 3 students, and a short portfolio of recordings of your playing is required to apply. See more information in the brochure at our website, catholicinstituteofsacredmusic.org. And now on to the interview. Kevin, it's so great to have you on the show today. Thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I look forward to this conversation.
So you have spent much of your career immersed in the works of French organist and composer Charles Tournemire, amongst many other things, of course, that you're interested in. And I suspect that a number of people in our audience have heard of or perhaps even played Tournemire's works. But for those for whom Tournemire is a new figure, could you tell us a bit about Tournemire's origins as a musician? Perhaps first sharing with us a bit about something he loved talking about, and that was his time studying with César Franck.
Well, it's unquestionable that the presence of César Franck looms large in Tournemire's life throughout. But let's go back to the beginning, because Tournemire left the city of Bordeaux, where he was born, as a 16-year-old to go study at the Paris Conservatoire. In 1888, he wanders into the Basilica of Saint Clotilde at Vespers, and what he hears strikes him to the point of almost incredulous. And he writes that he had never heard anyone play quite like Franck. And that impression was so great upon him that sometime thereafter, he showed up at César Franck's door at his apartment and promptly asked the master if he could study with him. And to which Franck said, "Well, come in." And he sat down and played a few Chopin etudes. And Franck said, "Oh, you have technique." And then Franck said, "Well, why don't you improvise?" And so he gave him a theme to improvise. And Tournemire did so. And he said, "Well, it's childish, but I'll take it. So you can come and study with me." And that begins the great relationship, unquestionably. So a couple of months later, Tournemire joins the organ class of César Franck, and within 6 months becomes the #1 student and takes up the question of studying both literature with him, but also what Franck was particularly good at, and that was improvisation. And that's really the ghost that looms over Tournemire's life for the rest of his life, is the access of improvisation that Franck was so good at, and that Tournemire eventually entered into as one of the great improvisateurs of that time. So Franck is very much all part of him. And Tournemire even went so far as that toward the end of his life in 1931, he wrote a little book on César Franck. Now, unfortunately, the book is probably more about Tournemire than it is about Franck, but nevertheless, he clearly comprehended the presence of Franck throughout his life and went so far as to doing that and everything. And I particularly appreciate that, because I think that Tournemire is the logical successor to the tradition of César Franck, and which got passed on to Jean Langlais and to that. So Franck is definitely a part of his life from the get-go.
Yeah, it's almost like he considers him a sort of fatherly figure, and it really shapes his whole conception of his career in front of him too. But
Right.
things didn't go according to how Tournemire wanted to. So could you describe some of those early career difficulties and disappointments that he encountered along that path that he imagined for himself?
Well, certainly the death of César Franck was a huge impression upon him. There's a story that I cannot substantiate that says that Tournemire was at the piano with César Franck as he was playing his 3 chorales for his students. But I'm not sure of that. But in any case, Franck dies, and Tournemire is left with, well, what to do next? And then he continues the organ class, but Charles-Marie Widor takes over him. And Widor was not particularly nice to Tournemire because he found that Tournemire was spending too much time on improvisation. Now, Tournemire writes that Widor's influence upon him was great in terms of technique. And that's unquestionable. Even in his later years, and even when Widor dies, he acknowledges the influence of Widor on his technique. But it was clearly a big disappointment to lose Franck. So Tournemire continues on, and he takes over a Jesuit place and teaches and whatnot. And Gabriel Piernet took over the titular organ at Saint-Clotilde. And therefore, when Piernet resigned, and I'm not even sure exactly why he resigned, Tournemire did get to take the titular organ at Saint-Clotilde. And thus begins a relationship with that church for the rest of his life. Clearly, that is another one of those things or places that enter into the experience of Tournemire. Now, Tournemire marries in 1904 to a woman by the name of Alice Taylor, who exposes him to literature and all sorts of things, and even including the works of the French philosophers and mystics Leon Bloy. And Tournemire's wife was the sister-in-law of Paladin, the great spiritualist writer, and whatnot. So he's entered into another world, so to speak, as a result of this. But life, as we all know, sometimes has its ups and downs, and he was conscripted during the war. But those are also the years in which he wrote all his symphonies, which I think is absolutely fascinating and something very few people really know, that Tournemire actually wrote symphonies, and they're remarkable. And then I think the big deal that really changed him was the death of his first wife. She dies in 1920, and Tournemire, I think, from what I've read from the letters and I've seen, that there was a particularly difficult time. And then in 1925, when the position for the organ chair becomes available at the Conservatoire, Tournemire tries for that, because his goal, at least as he stated, was that he would do everything that Franck did. He was the organist at Saint-Clotilde, he took care of the ensemble at the Conservatoire, and then he would become the chair of the organ at the Conservatoire. He was the organist at Saint-Clotilde, and he became the ensemble professor, but he was not given the organ position because of conflicts with Charles-Marie Widor and, of course, Marcel Dupré, his prize student. So Tournemire's life is how shall you say it, a kind of up and down affair, and certainly one that was affected by externals as much as anything that you can say about a composer's life.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we could talk a little bit about his personality. I mean, he was not the sunniest and rosiest of characters, I think, and some of that played into this too, that he was kind of a difficult guy to get along with.
Sure. Jeanette Anglaire, which was André Marchal's daughter, whom I fortunately got to meet in the late 80s, told a great story about Tournemire, and it is one that I can substantiate, is that Martial he would have visitors and Tournemire would come, and Tournemire would ask all of the children in the room to leave because he wanted nothing to do with the children. And he was rather gruff, as Madame Anglais used to say, whereas Vierne would come and he would bring candies and smile and play with the children. And so I think that tells you probably as much as you need to know about Tournemire in terms of his disposition. I find his disposition fascinating, but also at times horrifying.
Yeah. Yeah. And it seems to me to, in that competition for the chair at the conservatoire, in his competition with Dupré came across as very polished and professional and affable in all the ways that Tournemire just wasn't.
Yeah. Linwood Farnham says it perfectly because he was a friend of Tournemire's. In fact, there's a wonderful picture of them standing out in front of the Basilica in 1930. And Farnham's very little remarks, but I think they tell everything that you want to know, and that is Tournemire was just simply not able to market himself. Mm-hmm. And I think that's true. And I think Tournemire's disposition was such that he felt like he didn't need to, they would come to him.
Right.
And that did not happen. And he became increasingly disappointed about that and acerbic. And if you read the memoirs in later years, it's just horrifying to see what he wrote. And we don't know all of what he wrote because his second wife destroyed much of it. And I wish to see that, but you can only do.
Yeah. So we'll get to the people being drawn to him in a moment, but let's talk a little bit about his work at St. Clotilde. What did his Sunday schedule look like, and how did it interact with the singing there at the Basilica?
Tournemire was the titular organist at St. Clotilde. He was there in 1898 and until his death in 1939. And he took over the position from Gabriel Piernet. And Tournemire's job was to play for the Mass. He was not to play for the choir because the choir had a separate organist and director. And so he was the Grand Orgue player. And so his improvisations were in the context of that. There are some fascinating stories that Jean Langlais has passed on about the situation of Tournemire at St. Clotilde, which includes such wonderful remarks as Tournemire could not stand the choir because they were not very good. And he constantly was disdainful of that experience. But by the same token, I love what Olivier Messiaen said about him, which was when he was in front of the Blessed Sacrament, his improvisations were nothing short of stellar. And that's a paraphrase of mine, but it really is something to be said, that his improvisations were incredibly powerful and experiential in the context of the Mass at that time. And Tournemire, I think he was most at home in playing at Mass. And that is something that I love to think about in my own life, is that's where he was home. And that experience of the liturgy and the chants are such a powerful influence upon him.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about his improvisation. And again, so many people came to hear him in the gallery and at Mass. And so could you place him in that sort of constellation of French improvisers in terms of his lineage, but also maybe give us a picture of what was so attractive about his improvisations?
Well, the best part that we have about Tournemire's improvisations is we have actual recordings of them. And that's an important question to look at, because in 1931, he made 5 recordings of improvisations for Polydor Records. And they are a living record of his abilities. And if you listen to them, they are nothing short of just remarkable. I mean, you listen to them and you go, oh, they're not written down. These are not written down. These are him actually at the instrument. And of course, at 1931, the organ still sounded like what Franck was playing on. And so you not only get his improvisations, but you get the sound of the organ of Saint Clotilde as Franck would have heard it. So Tournemire was clearly impassioned by the chant. And that is a subject that we can spend lots of time on, but we can also look at it in the context of his compositions, because clearly the chant is something that has great hold on him. Particularly after his first wife dies, he starts visiting Salem and spends a lot of time there. And that perhaps is the impetus to L'Orgue Mystique, but it also is probably the impetus toward moving toward what I call Tournemire's spiritual improvisations, which are solely dependent on the experience of the liturgy and the chant. It's remarkable, his chant books, which still exist. In fact, I've had the good fortune to hold one of his chant books in my hand, which was nothing short of spiritual for myself. But you can see some of the marks that he has in the sides of the book, and you can see some of the concerns that he has, to emphasize the word or a phrase or something like that. So I think it's fantastic that his improvisations were so informed by the chant. And it's really particularly interesting because when you see him in the context of the lineage, certainly we know that Franck was in contact with the chant, but there was not so much going on in the rest of the world. For instance, Vidor was not a big fan of improvisations on chant. We only see in his last two symphonies that he takes up the question of the chant in his own work. But also the founding of the Schola Cantorum in Paris, that probably informed a lot of people toward that. But I think all of those things, plus Tournemire's rather mystical sense of who he was in the context of an organist, are what make his improvisations incredible. Langley talks about that, when you went to hear Tournemire, that it was just like taking up prayer. And I can believe it. If you've heard the recordings, you can understand that they really just are simply remarkable.
Yeah. Maybe you could talk a little bit and tell the famous story about the sortee and the, but, I mean, what's seems to me to be at the heart of it is that sense of prayerfulness that you were mentioning, being in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament. And so sometimes the organ did roar, but sometimes it was also a little quieter than other people thought it should be.
Oh, yes. Well, L'Orgue Mystique is a perfect example of that. We'll talk about that in a minute. But yes, there's a wonderful story that the organ was not being played very loudly. And an assistant to Tournemire said, well, Master, this is the sortee. And the tradition in the French experience was that the organ would play loud and people would leave. In fact, there's a fun story that Saint-Saëns says that the louder the organ plays or the bigger the fugue, the more the people leave. But in any case, Tournemire was told by his assistant, well, Master, it's the sortee. And Tournemire turned around rather gruffly to him and he says, well, then sortee, which means to leave. Well, go, leave yourself. So anyway, another example of that gruff and indiscriminate response on the part of the master.
Indeed. So let's move now to a little bit about a topic that both you and I love so much, which is Tournemire's L'Orgue Mystique. You've already mentioned it a little bit, but it's definitely a project that every Catholic organist should know about. What are the inspirations for this project? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Wow, that is a topic we could spend lots of time on. Well, I think we have to start with the fact that after the death of his first wife, he began to spend time at Saint Pierre de Salem, the monastery, the Benedictine monastery, which is so famous in the world for Gregorian chant scholarship and performance and all that. And I believe that is the beginnings of where he goes with this, because after this death of his first wife, he finds himself kind of empty and despondent. And I think the church becomes even more important to him. I've never thought that it wasn't, but I think after the death of his first wife, he really begins to spend more and more time on the question. And also, because of that, we can look at his opus numbers and see that his later works are all religious-based. So, with regards to L'Orgue Mystique, L'Orgue Mystique came out of the practical experience of Tournemire as an organist at the Roman Mass at that time. Now, let's remember that we're not talking about the Novus Ordo. We are talking about the Latin, what we would call the Latin Mass, and particularly as it was played out in the Diocese of Paris. So those are the beginnings of that. We cannot ignore the fact that in 1922, he was given a copy of Guéranger's L'Année Liturgique, the liturgical year, which was a huge 16 volumes of commentary on the liturgy. And I think he got a hold of those. I'm not sure who gave them or if he got them himself, but in any case, those are the beginnings of the inspiration for L'Orgue Mystique, because I think he connected all of those things in the context of his life. We cannot ignore the fact that he also spent time from about 1900 on in a small island called Ouessant, which is off the coast of Brittany. And he spent a lot of time there, and the connection of nature and the power of the wind and the power of nature in general were influences that certainly entered into. Because if you look at the text at L'Orgue Mystique that he spends much time at, they are the Psalms. And the Psalms become the vehicle for him to see, and it connects him with Guéranger's writing. And there we go. By 1925, he announces at Joseph Bonnet's wedding that he's going to take up this project of making L'Orgue Mystique. Now, we should note that it was not originally named L'Orgue Mystique. It actually had another name, this set of pieces, and the original name was called L'Orgue Glorieux, the glorious organ. But somewhere along the way, in the midst of the composition, he changed it to L'Orgue Mystique, which we translate as the mystical organ. And I find that change, though it might be subtle, I think it's an important difference, because therefore the organ becomes not just unto itself, but a handmaiden to the liturgy. And I think for Tournemire, the organ was exactly that, a handmaiden to the liturgy. Yeah. In fact, he says in his later years, as he plays, that organ music without God is like a body without a soul.
Yeah. And, it seems to me like as an example, that one shift is exemplary of other shifts that happened to him spiritually, that from that reading of Guéranger, right? Like, so I always think that that's like the main thing that church musicians should be reading, especially during Lent and Advent and all those seasons of greater
most assuredly. I return to Guéranger almost yearly at some point every year, because I still find it very rich. And I'm fortunate that I can read it in the original French, so that makes it even more fascinating. But yes, absolutely. The other thing that we cannot forget about is that the Benedictines returned back from their exile in 1921 from Coire Abbey, and they took up their scholarship. And so by 1925, the Bishop of Paris okays the authorization for the Vatican chant books to be used in the Diocese of Paris. And thus we have this kind of excitement about the chant. There are liturgical days at Saint Clotilde that Tournemire writes about, and Langlais even talks about it, that, when the chant was being discussed and all that. And there were whole congresses to study the chant in the late 20s and everything. So you can see the advent or return, more or less, of the chant in the life of the church in that particular point.
Yeah, and you mentioned too Joseph Bonnet, who was tertiary at Salem, who's an oblate at Salem, and one of Tournemire's students. And it seemed to me that that there was that lovely address that Bonnet gave in, I think, 1920. We published a translation of it a couple of years ago in Sacred Music about the role of the organist. It's such a wonderful document, just like to think about what is a Catholic organist as opposed to, like the role of the Lutheran organist, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. It seems to me that Bonnet was really instrumental in that too. And I wonder if Tournemire, looking at, maybe his life situation, his career, found in this sort of Gregorian Renaissance an opportunity to kind of restart his career.
I think it's possible. I think that the circumstances of his life after 1920, the death of his first wife, affected him greatly. And perhaps in that context, yes, one could see a possibility for himself. And if you know L'Orgue Mystique, that there is this sentence which regards to, just as J.S. Bach had done for the Protestants, it was going to be Tournemire's job to do the same for the Catholics in terms of bringing organ music based on the music of that time. And I love that model, because I think we certainly can appreciate Bach for what he was in terms of his context, but Tournemire sees himself in that context as taking up the Catholic experience. And that Catholic experience, in my opinion, and you can fight, is the primary example for us today. I mean, it informs me. It continues to inform me because of my love for the chant and the love for Tournemire, but the example that Tournemire sought in the context of L'Orgue Mystique.
Yeah. So let's get into that more deeply. Let's maybe talk perhaps about the pieces of L'Orgue Mystique, the overall structure of it, but then how the pieces for like one day interfaced with the Mass. I mean, a main question that a lot of people have when they first discover this is, are these pieces, they're designed to be played at a low Mass or at a high Mass? Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Well, first of all, Tournemire envisioned them to be played at the high Mass. And they were intended to be in the context of high Mass with a choir. Okay. Langlais often told the story that the choir sometimes would try to get their pitch from L'Orgue Mystique pieces, and it was a disaster. But in any case, Tournemire envisioned these pieces to be in the context of high Mass. He intended them to be as a kind of commentary to the chants themselves. So let's break down L'Orgue Mystique. First of all, it's 51 suites of music for the whole church year in the context of how the organ functioned at Saint Clotilde. So, for instance, the organ functioned during Advent only during the third Sunday of Advent and the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. Then the organ did not function in Lent, with the exception of Laetare Sunday. And then the organ cycle continues on with Holy Saturday, and then takes up the whole question of the church year from there. Now, Tournemire divided his cycle up into three groups: the Christmas cycle, the Easter cycle, and then the cycle after Pentecost. So those are the three main divisions. Tournemire wrote the Easter cycle first because he intended the Easter cycle to be, quote, a light to enlighten all the other cycles, which is a beautiful image when you think about it. Okay, so you have some 14 hours of music over the course of 51 suites. Let's look at how they're dealt with in the context of one day. For Tournemire's time, they always began with an asperge. So the Mass did not begin with the introit, it began with the asperge. And so while at the end of the asperge, there was time, a brief interlude for the organist to play while the priest went to change from cope to chasuble. And that is the first piece of the suites, and it's called the prelude to the introit. And it is based on the introit of the day. All right, then the next piece is the offertory, the offertoire, and it is generally based on the gradual chant of the day, though not always, but most of the time it is informed by the gradual chant. Then, peculiar to the experience of at least France, though I'm told in some other places too, there was a piece called the Elevation, the Elevation. And in the Diocese of Paris, there were different responses to it. But at Saint Clotilde, there was usually a small piece that was played after the chalice and the bread were blessed. And so there was time enough for that. And then the communion is a piece played before the communion chant, because at that time, the organ played before the communion chant, and the communion chant was done at the end. So there are your four major pieces that are done during the liturgy. Then we come to number 5, which is the pièce terminale, the terminal piece. The terminal piece, Tournemire saw in a very spiritual manner, because he thought that people should stay after Mass and contemplate the mysteries, and his music was to accompany that contemplation. So the music for the pièce terminale, the chants, are sometimes the chants for the Vespers, sometimes a hymn that would be responsible or proper to the day, or other motivic elements that would inform the day's piece. And the pièce terminale is the largest one of the 5, and is generally the most difficult.
Certainly, yes. So we'll talk a little bit more about difficulty, but could you tell us a little bit about how Tournemire incorporates the chant into the pieces?
That too is a beautiful experience, because Tournemire, by his own response, said that he could not use the solemn rhythms for his paraphrases. So Tournemire treats the chant rhythmically as he wishes. Now, he's very responsible to the chant in terms of the shape and the experience. But in terms of the rhythm, it's Tournemire's own response in terms of that. But he takes the chants and states them quite clearly in either the hands or the pedal. And you can, if you know the chants, you will hear them. Now, the unfortunate thing that Tournemire did not do for us is that he did not name the chants in his scores. And that is a subject that I'd like to take up toward the end of this. But in any case, the chants are present in the pieces in terms of not only their relationship to where they're sung, but also to how long the pieces are, because the prelude to the introit is very short. You're lucky to hear the chant a little, or it's in entirety and then that's it. The offertory is a little more involved, but it too is not greatly long. The elevation is certainly short, and the communion is probably the most fascinating because he has a little more time to play with it, and he takes it up harmonically. And as he himself says, his compositional style is to be like garlands upon the chant and to create living strings of beauty in the context of the Mass, which frankly is quite beautiful if you ask me.
Yeah. And harmonically speaking, it's not just a simple modal approach where he remains in the modes. Could you talk a little bit about his harmonic approach?
No, his system is definitely responsive to the question of the modes, because the modes had kind of gone out of style, at least in terms of improvisation. So I think he receives from Franck the harmonic language of the late Wagnerians, because Franck himself was happy with the Wagnerian harmonics in experience. Tournemire just built upon that. But he also takes from people like Debussy and Ravel, even though he did not care for Ravel at all. You can hear his harmonic system. And toward the end of his life, it gets very complicated, and it foreshadows, in my opinion, Olivier Messiaen.
Let's talk a little bit about the registration, and then maybe we can also talk a little bit about difficulty level. This is a little bit of a thorny subject, especially for the average Catholic Church organist who might be feeling really excited right now about what you're saying and feel like they have just found the answer to all their repertoire questions. Well, that they can just just sit down with Tournemire at every single Mass and play this. But could you talk a little bit about registration and difficulty?
Tournemire is definitely a product of the Romantic French organ building experience, of Aristide Cavaillé. The organ at Saint-Clotilde was, up until 1933, when Tournemire rebuilt it, a Cavaillé with all the sonorities that go with that. I am fortunate that I play all of the suites in one portion or another. I do not play all of the pièces terminales, though my goal in my life before I die is to finish doing that. I play a number of them. And I would say that for registration-wise, the first four pieces, the Prelude to the Introit, the Offertoire, and the Elevation, and the Communion, are very accessible from a standpoint of American organ building. You will find mostly what you need. Be it rest assured, Tournemire tells you what you need to do. So you have to probably make some compromises along the way. But as a general rule, you will find what you need for Tournemire on your average 2 to 3 manual American instrument. Now, when it's not there, well, then you have to make some choices. I mean, there are certain stops that were on the Saint-Clotilde organ, particularly after Tournemire had it rebuilt in 1933, that, if I only had that stop, I would be complete, a septième or something like that. But as a general rule, I don't find Tournemire's music that difficult to register in terms of the first four pieces. Now, the pièce terminale, that's another story. It's not complicated, but it takes some thought to the question, particularly as Tournemire places his hands upon the manuals, which Tournemire was known to have interesting hand positions to accomplish what he needed. And that's okay if you know that, but if you don't know that, you look at some of the pièces terminales and go, what was he doing?
Yeah, it does feel like a little bit like acrobatics sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's a great little overview of L'Orgue Mystique, and I hope that our listeners will check it out if they haven't already. But he wrote so many amazing other things, and you already alluded to his works for orchestra, his symphonies. But he wrote chamber music, music for piano, songs, music for the stage. What are some of your favorite compositions for organ besides L'Orgue Mystique?
I have a clear and present love for the Opus 67, 7 chorales on the 7 last words Brist, which I have been playing now for almost 6 years, every year during Holy Week. And I have come to absolutely adore them for their harmonic language, for their spiritual content, for their commentary on the events of Holy Week. I find them extremely rich. Now, they are not easy pieces to take up. That needs to be known going forward. Some of them are easier than others, and one of them is particularly, you might say, odd in its expression. But given that, that's fine. I also love the 6 little musical flowers. Those are lovely pieces that are not that difficult and very accessible and harmonically probably a lot more tame, even though they were written later on in his life. Then the last works, the Symphonie Sacrée, the Sacred Symphony, and others are just magnificent pieces. The unfortunate part is that they are not easy and their harmonic language is challenging, along with the 3 poems, the 3 poems. The later works are really some of the most remarkable. Now, I have several friends who play his early work called the Triple Chorale, which is a commentary on the Holy Trinity. And that's a lovely piece too. It's a little long for use in the liturgy, but makes a great recital piece. And the harmonic language is, again, very accessible, but not terribly difficult to manage and whatnot. There's a piece that I really love that hardly anyone knows about. It's the Opus 8 Angelic Salutation for violin and either organ or piano. And in fact, I just discovered it a couple of years ago myself. And it is early Tournemire, and it's early Tournemire, but it is still so beautiful. It's just really wonderful piece.
Yeah. And it seems to me also that we'd be remiss to forget speaking about the easier pieces that he wrote, in case our listeners are looking for some, easier things. The pieces he wrote for harmonium.
Yes, the Sei Fioretti. Very good. Yes, those are wonderful pieces too. And I confess that I use those pieces when I need something and I just sight read them. But that's okay because they're useful in the context. And once you start to learn to play Tournemire, those are not difficult and they're very useful. And as you noted, they are for the harmonium or for the organ. So yes, absolutely.
So, of all the other compositions in his output, what might you recommend to a new listener as a means of discovering some of the gems in his work outside of those works for organ?
Well, again, I return to the symphonies because the symphonies are remarkable works unto themselves and kind of foreshadow the orchestration of Ravel and Honegger, and even to some extent, a little bit Olivier Messiaen. The symphonies have been recorded. It's been some years since they are. And I've even heard recently that there might be an attempt to re-record them, which would make me excited. I think the symphonies are worth their time. And I listen to them as much as I listen to any romantic orchestral work. And they have their own language and they have their own experience. And the language is not unreasonable in the context of the time. Sometimes I think when I close my eyes that I'm actually listening to something like Lake Vaughan Williams or something like that. But they're glorious works. They really are. The most exciting thing I've come upon with Tournemire in the last year or two is an opera company in Germany in the city of Ulm performed and recorded his opera La Légende de Tristan, The Legend of Tristan. It was performed in December, but they made the recording accessible to us until the end of May. And I sat down one day to listen to it and was just absolutely enraptured by the experience, particularly the last act. It was glorious. And you knew you were listening to Tournemire, but you kept saying, oh, this is opera. And he's taken that up and really made it beautiful too.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Kevin. This has been a delightful overview of Tournemire. And, I'm sure listeners enjoy as much as I do your love and enthusiasm for Tournemire, which is just contagious. And so thank you for sharing that with us.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to share something that I dearly love. And even though people find him difficult, as I do myself, I find in him an incredible spiritual treasure that I hope us as Roman Catholics will take up in the organ world. Thank you so much.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole, from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is from the Prelude and Fugue in G major, BWV 550 by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.